Well, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Thanks everybody for coming out. It's nice weather out there, and I know it's hard to sit indoors for yet another hour or so. But we certainly appreciate everybody coming out. I'll let Dennis speak a little bit to tell you about Farm Credit and kind of give you the lay of the land real quick.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Brian. So, first of all, thanks again for coming out, and thanks for letting us be a part of the community. We always appreciate the chance to do that. How many of you, is this your first time coming out to Farm Credit Services America? A few newcomers. All right, so folks who have been here before, usually I'm saying a few things about the company. Help me out, what do you know about Farm Credit Services of America? Low money farmers, that's good. Actually, there are prizes that are life-changing tonight for these answers. So, anyhow, thank you, sir. What else do you know?
You running through the railroad?
What's that?
You're running through the railroad?
Running through the railroad.
Don't you load up cars?
Oh, we put a lot of grain on the railroad.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll take that.
I knew you
I don't
did.
need to be stingy with these prizes at all.
I knew you did.
Yes, sir.
Bids for cash bids, grains, etc. You're going to go ahead and mesh that out to the users.
That's right. You want blue or green?
I'll go green.
I hope this is a box of green. Oh, yeah. Good that. What else do you know? Yes, sir.
$18 billion public company.
We are actually, we were formerly 18 billion. We're about a $20 billion company. And we're actually a co-op. But anyway, that's right on the point. So, blue or green?
Blue.
Blue. Now I got to see.
They got two of
There
them.
you go. Absolutely. Thanks. What else you know?
So you should have a dog in the shop. Trade you for it.
What's that?
Dog in the shop.
We do have a dog. We have, if we don't, we should get one, right?
Trade you for green. You're an agile role in the shop.
We are agile. We've been agile for about 8 years, so you want blue or green?
We were originally located at 19th and Douglas Street, across from the place where I worked for the first time, home company.
That's right. That was when we were Farm Credit of the Midlands,
Okay.
and had about a bunch of mergers in between then, and became the association where we are now, where we work in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. So you guys have hit a lot of the high notes, so thanks for making my job easy. Let's see, lay of the land wise, restrooms are right around the corner.
Oh, I knew where they were at.
Cool. They are pretty nice, all right? And you know, please, we always say misery is optional, which means, you know, if you need to get up at any time, please go use that. There's a cooler around the corner. We've got free pop over there. Don't be shy if you need a soda. Anyhow, we're glad you're out. I'm always really thankful when your group reaches out to us for an opportunity to be a part of things. I'd say I get to see just a slice of what Brian and Matt do to help keep everything going, and so I'd say give a little thanks to them. If you clap loud enough, Matt will hear you too. So anyway.
Farm Credit's been a great host, a great partner to user groups, so we certainly thank you.
We're glad to do it. So let's see, any of you have a lightsaber? Do you have kids where you're going to have a competition in the house?
Oh, yeah.
You may need blue or green. Blue.
Oh.
All right. Shouldn't be left around. Anyhow, thanks a lot, and I know that ProCarmer's going to talk next. ProCarmer's a partner we've had in business over the years, so it's nice to get to partner up on food and building tonight, but anyhow, thanks for your generosity.
You gonna run the program this weekend?
Which one's that?
The one right here. Oh, no, that's up on, by 72nd.
Oh, we got to get caught up to that one, yeah.
You got,
We're not involved with that, or,
Oh, you're
I don't
not.
know it yet, so. Anyhow, we'll have to catch up to that. Tell me about
Okay.
that one later, so.
okay.
I guess
All next Saturday.
before I close out, I will tell you, also right now, we're looking for a lead developer on our team, so we've got an open posting, if that's fair game to say. And we're looking around the corner to next year where we'll have a lot of opportunities in our team, so hope to be able to tell you more about that. If that sounds exciting to you, or you know somebody it should sound exciting to, please pass on the word. It will help us out. So anyway, thanks a lot. There are more lightsabers there, so anyhow, you can pass them around. So thanks.
And sponsoring tonight is ProCarma, and Terry's here to say a word or two about ProCarma.
Thanks. I'm Terry Jones. I've had the pleasure of meeting a few faces in the room at prior engagements, some of which I didn't have the opportunity to make my way around to. So maybe before the night's over, I can give a card, put a name with a face, and see where it goes. But just a little bit about ProKarma. We're a 13-year-old software development company. We do a little bit of staff augmentation, but primarily we're a .NET, mixed environment .NET and Java shop, primarily an Agile shop as well. Roughly 1,700 employees, 16 offices in the United States, 2 in India, one in Argentina. 3 development centers, global headquarters here in Omaha, with an application and web development center here, mobile development center in Denver, mobile development center in Portland, Oregon, a creative development center in Denver, offshore development center in Chennai, and an SAP development center in Argentina. In the United States, we have roughly 300 plus openings right now that range from .NET development to Java to PMs, VAs, QA, you name it, mobile development, things like that. Here in Omaha, I've got lots of needs for a variety of folks that are like-minded as you guys are. So if there's, for example, so if there's someone that you know, maybe even yourself, friend, a colleague, maybe someone that is not in Omaha, one of the things that we do is relocation, which is kind of uncommon these days. We will help with relocation. We will help with sponsorship of H1, green card processing, and so forth. So there's really, it's a really good time to join ProKarma. I'm happy to be here. If anybody has any questions for me, you know where I'll be. Thank you for coming.
All right. Thanks, all right, and I think we're to the point where we're ready to introduce our speaker. I guess before we do that, was there any other announcements anybody had to share with the group or anything?
I do have one more, Brian.
Okay.
I don't want to take all this pizza home. So whatever's left when you guys are done, it's fair game.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and introduce our speaker, Brent, and comes to us from Infragistics. And I'll let him get started.
Cool, excellent. Who will vouch for me that I am here legally? Because this will bother me during this. Someone? Anyone? All right, good. We got volunteers. Awesome. I don't feel like wearing them. How is everyone? Good? Good. All right. When I originally started doing this talk, that was the title. Applied Metro Design for Windows Devices. Aside from being a terrible talk title because it's got too many words, does anybody know what else is wrong with it? Yeah, it's not Metro anymore. So let's do something about that. Yeah. So for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, last year in August, there's a lot of news that came around that Microsoft was dropping the term Metro. It was never an official product name, but it was widely used to describe the design language that's used in Windows Phone and Windows 8. It's also now on Microsoft.com, Xbox dashboards, pretty much everywhere if Microsoft is doing design. But why did they drop it? Well, there's a company called Metro AG over in Europe that do software related to groceries and things like that. And everyone thought, well, why don't they just take them to court? It's such a good name. Well, for context, Metro AG makes about $6.5 billion in revenue. Microsoft is around 6.1. You don't take companies to court that make more money than you. Usually doesn't end well. So that's why, more or less, they axed that. There's some news that came around that said, maybe we should call this Modern UI style. So I thought, okay, we could do Modern UI for Windows 8. That's a better title. It's shorter, it's concise. There's a problem with that, though. No one from Microsoft ever said that. It was The Verge and various other news sites and articles from college campuses. There's a ton of places this was used, but it was never from the horse's mouth. And that worried me because I was writing a book about the subject that the talk is on tonight, and I didn't want to use the wrong phrasing. So I asked the guys at Microsoft, the platform evangelists at Microsoft, what are you being told to call this? The safest thing that they could give me, and the thing that they were being told to call it, was Microsoft Design Style. I know, same reaction I had. Like, that doesn't have the zing of Metro, right? And we'll talk about where Metro kind of came from in a bit and why it was a good name, but you know, I erased it from their poster. That poster said Metro, we are Metro, and Fast and Fluid is one of the things we'll talk about later, but we're no longer calling it Metro, we're now calling it Microsoft Design Style. But it's descriptive, it's just not a great name. But it's descriptive because it's Microsoft.com, it's Windows Phone, it's Windows 8, it's Xbox Dashboard, it's pretty much, like I said, everything that they touch from a design perspective. And I went to go check out on MSDN, and lo and behold, right there where the arrow points, it says, embrace Microsoft Design Style principles. Where it says Microsoft Design Style, it used to say Metro. That's a long-winded way of saying that I titled the talk, Designing for Windows 8. Sometimes you just gotta change your strategy, right? And that's what the book is titled. Now, Microsoft's been nice and they've granted us a 0.1, so we'll talk a little bit about 0.1. But before we get really rolling, do I have any designers in the room? There's a lot of design content here. Right, yeah, okay, no designers. This might be a problem. Actually, it's not a problem. How about we try this from a different perspective? Do I have back-end database developers? Keep your hands up, front-end developers? Yeah, people in the middle, other development. Yeah, guess what? You've all designed something at some point, whether it be a schema or some sort of interaction between the actual visual design and how it gets implemented into the UI, or the interfaces between several components. You've designed something. It's a different kind of design than what we're going to be talking about here. But the concepts, a lot of the concepts I'm going to talk about apply. Whether we're talking about actual UI design, visual design, or more of that sort of logical design kind of stuff. I like to cover this from a perspective where you can take something out of this even if you don't do the stuff that we're going to talk about. A little background on me. I'm a technical evangelist at Infradistics, but I didn't start out as a technical evangelist at Infradistics. I started out on our interaction design team, on the developer side of things. If you're not familiar with what Infradistics does, we make third-party controls, like maps, grids, charts, these sorts of things that you can drop into your application, hook your data up to it. We give you a nice design for that, and you can customize it from there. There's a lot of features that we have to decide what we're going to put in there, right? Whether that's a good feature for the end user, how is the developer going to implement it, what's the API for that. I was on that, how's the developer going to do it, the API side, what's the design time experience, that kind of stuff. And the other side of the team works on what features do the users need at runtime. So there's a lot of thought that goes into that sort of stuff. I come from a computer science background, but over time I've picked up a lot of design chops as I've gone along. So I feel in a privileged position to be able to talk to both sides, design and development. So that's what I bring to the table in terms of talking to you guys as developers about design. Where can you find me if you need to find me later? At Brent Schooley on Twitter. The second link is my Infradistics blog. That's where I do most of my content posts. The third one is my personal site where when I go on these crazy trips where I'm in 3 user groups in a row and go around town, I post about things that I saw in your town. So you might see stuff about Omaha on there, if I get around to updating that. I also wrote this thing. If you find the content in this talk interesting, go buy that because it expands on it about twice as much as what we'll have in here. It's covered in there. So let's dig in. And we'll start at the start. What is Microsoft Design Style? And more to the point, why? Where did it come from? A lot of times people think that there's a lot of arbitrary decisions in Windows 8 in terms of the UI, how it's put together. I'd like to debunk some of that by showing you some of the stuff that Microsoft's design research team thought about when they came up with this design language 10, maybe 12 years ago. It's been in the works for a long time. Introduction to some Microsoft design principles. This is the Metro stuff, the 5 posters that they used to have. We'll talk about those. Lots of practical info in there to sort of take back to your role, whatever it is. And then in the last section, we'll take a Windows 7 desktop app and transport it over to a Windows 8 app. Before I get going, what time does this end? So I can pace.
We're a little flexible.
Okay.
7:30.
Okay.
A little bit late, so.
Okay, yep, we can pace off that. All right, let's dig in. What is this thing? Microsoft Design Style, what used to be Metro, and why? Three key inspiration areas that the design team looked into. The first one is Bauhaus, or something that it's also called the modern design movement. Bauhaus, school of design, primarily focused around architecture, but they dipped into other things. Late 1910s to early 1930s, so that's the time period we're talking about. Right after the Industrial Revolution, so we've got new materials that enable new processes that enable designers to go nuts, right? And this turns a certain subculture off, right? They don't like this. And Walter Gropius, the founder of this movement, said, hey, a design should be true to itself. There shouldn't be any extra lies or trivialities thrown into the design. Basically, distill the thing down to its essence and design that, right? If you've heard the term form follows function, that line of thinking comes out of this movement. It's similar to this movement. So what he's saying is, don't throw extra features and extra embellishments and designer's whim into the design. Design the thing at the most straightforward approach possible. So let's look at some examples in terms of architecture of the opposite of this, so that we can rein back in and look at what it actually is. So here are some buildings that are designed in the expressionist form of thinking, which is designer's whim. Make the building look like whatever you want. Curves for the sake of curves, weird angles for the sake of weird angles, windows shaped however you want, whatever you want to do. And that's not just back in that time period, we still see some of this today. But most of the time when we think of a modern designed office building, it looks something more like this, more like the building you're in now. Common regular size shaped walls, regular shaped windows, nothing crazy. Maybe that doesn't hit home. So everyone think of a chair. Every single one of you think of a chair. And by a show of hands, how many of you thought of this chair? No one, right? Why not? Right, this is pretty far from the norm for a chair. This is a chair with every bell and whistle, every feature, every possible thing that you could add to a chair thrown in there. When I think of a chair, I think of this chair. It's Eames Lounger. It's possibly one of the most comfortable chairs in the world, as this gentleman will illustrate to you. This chair has one problem though. It's a $4,500 chair without the ottoman. But hey, free shipping. What's the point? The point is this is probably closer to the chair that you thought of when I said chair. It's a classical, straight up Bauhaus style chair. 4 legs, somewhere to sit down on, maybe armrests, maybe not. Not everyone thinks of armrests being on a chair. I like them. And a back. Also optional, but certainly much more comfortable if it's there. But this is Bauhaus. When you think of a chair, you think of this chair. Form follows function, simplicity. Talk about how that applies to Windows 8 later. Second inspiration, international typographic style, what's also known as Swiss design. A lot easier to see it first than to talk about it. This is one aspect of it. Clean typography, strong sense of alignment, different font sizes and font weights establish a hierarchy within the document. Your eye knows what's important, what's next important after that. Simply in this case, based on how things are aligned and how they're expressed using different font sizes and weights. No color in this one, but that's not to say that color is not an important aspect of this design movement. In fact, bold colors. These are album covers reimagined as Swiss design posters. So note here that you've still got that strong typography sense, and you've still got alignment even when things are along a diagonal. Right? There's a diagonal line that provides structure that all of the diagonal text lines up on. Another key piece to this, clean icons, clean iconography. So you've seen this all over Windows Phone and Windows 8. This one's a security check. Here we've got a bag on a scale for checking. Trying to find a bathroom in a foreign country. I bet you'll be able to find it based on male and female illustrations. This one's also handicapped accessible. Another universal internationally reinforced icon, right? Transit. This is where the metro comes from, right, originally. A lot of this comes from road signs. Here we've got that clean typography, but we've also got motifs around circles, letters, numbers, right? This is in New York. We travel over to Japan. We still got the colors for the lines, but we can bring it around if we travel further. Here the circles come back, the letters and the numbers indicating the different transit lines. Pretty interesting how, spanning different cultures, we've come up with the same things to label them. Speaking of that, there's been a lot of English text on these signs, and everywhere it appears, it's using the same font. Does anybody know what that super famous font is?
Helvetica?
Yes, Helvetica. You win a prize, but I don't have a prize. The prize is all of you get to go out to Netflix and watch the film called Helvetica. Go check it out. Honestly, spend 10 minutes. If you don't find it interesting within the first 10 to 15 minutes, you can turn it off. You might watch the whole thing. The reason being, this font is everywhere. It's in several iconic logos that you see all the time, and it's on every road sign. It's on every building sign. It's everywhere. But also, I want you to watch it because I think typography is a very interesting on-ramp for developers to design. There's a lot of number-based rules, logical constructs that make font work within a design. And I think if it piques your interest at all, it's something to look into. Whole books have been written on typography because there's a lot of rules. I couldn't talk about Swiss design without this huge example of Swiss road signs. Why? Well, to reinforce the fact that these aren't that dissimilar than ours. It's very similar as you go country to country. They had some different symbols there for things that perhaps we don't have, since we don't have a lot of transit. But when I put this in my slide deck, I felt a little guilty because I had lifted it wholesale from a Microsoft presentation, and some of the pictures earlier as well. But I wanted to replace this one with something bigger. I didn't have this in mind. These are actually the walls of a travel museum in Switzerland. It's the Swiss Travel Museum. If we walk around that museum, we get some reinforcements of all the rules we were talking about. Clean type, strong sense of alignment, the iconography, and then a little splash of the vibrant colors on the right. So it kind of brings it all around. And then we get this. This is that flippy schedule board for trains, and it's starting to look a little bit like a grid, which reminds me to come back around to talking about typographic grids. Now, when I say typographic grid, I'm not talking about this grid. It's a data grid. All of you developers are familiar with data grids. I'm not talking about that. This one is made by Infragistics. Check it out. It's cool. But I'm talking about this kind of grid. This is a grid system. This one's for a website. So 960 pixels wide, broken up into 6 columns. We could say perhaps that the width of an article is 4 of those columns, and maybe the sidebar on a blog is 2. And then we could write different CSS rules to figure out how to place that on the page. Windows 8 has one of these, and it looks a little different. Each one of the major boxes in that grid represents 20 pixels. So where that line going across the top that says content region is, where it says 7 units down from the top, that represents 140 pixels. The left edge of the application starts 6 units in, it's 120 pixels. Do you need to memorize that? Do you need to write that down? No, please don't. However, if you do want to write something down, design.windows.com has every single one of these, and there's a ton of them. It has all of them, and you can check those out. Also, the templates that come with Visual Studio and Blend have all of these sorts of rules baked into them automatically for you. Another thing that you don't need to memorize, and I don't know who would want to, is the type ramp, something called a type ramp. This indicates font sizes, font weights, font colors to use in different scenarios around your application. It reads a little bit like an eye chart, and if you're not a designer, you might get lost pretty quickly. You don't need to memorize this yet again because these come also with the templates. You get style names or CSS classes for all of these, for the different places that you'll use them. I don't like to look at it this way anyways, I like to look at it this way. 42, 20, 11, and 9. So you've got your title, your subtitle, body text and list item headers, and then your tertiary information, so subheaders for list items, right? Don't worry about the font sizes and weights there. Again, you're going to get those as style names. Sorry. Motion design, cinematography. This is the third one that we're going to talk about, and that, honestly, animation is everywhere within Windows 8 and Windows Phone. So it's all over this design style. It's hugely important. Animation tells stories. It indicates application flow. It basically keeps things moving. And it keeps things fresh in the case that I'm going to talk about for Windows 8. Cinematography, though, we'll talk about Saul Bass. Saul Bass was the creator of the opening animation title sequences for pretty much every single Hitchcock film. So these are short, 90 to 150 second animated sequences that come at the beginning of a movie that kind of tell the plot in an abstract way. And I'll talk in a second about what that means for Windows 8, but first, he said that design is thinking made visual. Look at this two ways. There's one obvious, straightforward way to look at this, which is you're designing something, you've got that up in your head, take those thoughts, put them on the page. Everyone kind of knows what that is, right? That's sort of the typical design thinking process. But we're forgetting that we're building an application that users are going to use. And when they use the application that has your design, they are going to think things, right? What do you want them to think when they're using your application, when they're working with your design? Do you want them to feel happy? Do you want them to feel productive? Whatever it is, your design has to evoke those thoughts. So keep that side of the thinking in mind when you're working on your application. More to the point for what we're talking about here, though, he said that the point of making these opening title sequences, the whole goal when you put one of these together, was to establish some sort of emotional resonance, some connection with the viewer before the film started. So before it even started rolling, these guys were already attached to it. They were already ready to go. I'll talk in a second about how you can do that in Windows 8 and how you can reinforce that connection. But first, let's take a quick look at some of this stuff. If you find these interesting, or this sort of process, for instance, these aren't made for films anymore, really. Bond has one, but that's about it. There's a website devoted to this guy's opening title sequence work. It talks about the plot synopsis and has a synopsis of the title sequence. It kind of describes how they link up, and then there's a YouTube link off to the actual title sequence itself. Coming back around to Windows 8 though, if these are at the beginning of the film, it might make sense to think about what happens at the beginning of the Windows 8 experience, the start screen. So there's a lot of information that gets animated and pushed around on this screen. It's something that catches the user's eye. In fact, in this case with this one, there's a headline that appears on the news application, and the user clicks it to go read that. That's a connection that's been made between whatever rotated in on the tile and sort of the obvious jumping in. That's okay. That's an interesting data point, but let's talk for a second about this app right here, this People guy. In its default mode on Windows Phone and Windows 8, it rotates pictures, right, of people that you may have connected to on, this is primarily on Windows Phone that I'm talking, but it rotates in pictures of people that you've connected with on social networks. Now imagine a scenario, for instance, where a person throughout the week is thinking about someone that they haven't talked to in a while. And that picture appears on the People tile. Sort of before it's even registered consciously, it's almost a subconscious based on that emotional connection, they're gonna click that to go find that person's contact details. It's kind of something that's gonna just happen automatically. I guarantee you, I've had it happen to me. It just makes sense. That's data that's important to that person in the moment. It happens by chance in this case, but it doesn't have to happen by chance. On the bottom row, I've got this running application that is not using a live tile. Now what that application does, if it ever makes it into the store, is it keeps track of your data on runkeeper.com. So it knows, and then it maps it out for you. So you can go back in and look at the elevation that you ran, the pace that you had, and the actual GPS route that you took for the run. And if you pan across the bottom on the chart, there's a little GPS dot that'll trace the route for you. Now, I happen to know that last weekend you ran a record 5K, both in elevation climbed and time. So it's actually a really good record. That's really important information that I should probably be showing on that tile right now. Because you come back to the computer and you're like, this thing says, congratulations, you just set a new record. Very likely that you're going to, the ego check, right? You're very likely to launch the application at that point. It's very important that you get users back into your application after they've installed it. Eventually there's going to be a sweep where they go, I don't need this stuff anymore. Users will get swept away. You can bring them back a lot, right? That won't happen to you. Figure out what data is important to your users and find ways to put it in front of them. So that's all of the history
Quick
lessons.
question.
Yes.
I have Windows 8 on my PC.
Yeah.
When I click on somebody whose picture shows up under the.
Yeah.
It
That's
sends me to a directory.
Oh, sure.
When I wanna see the person.
That's a nightmare, right? Yeah,
Why
I
is
know.
that? Because I
There's
don't
no
think this is
active-
very intuitive anymore.
There's no active click area there. It's all one big tile. What I recommend for that, in my case, let's talk about the record, right? So you want to click that. It's very possible that your intention is, having seen a notification, click on the application, go into the application. There needs to be some section of the application right on that first screen that kind of has that info, recently added or something like that, recently shown. And I think that's kind of what's missing in that people case. But yeah, there's no API for doing that. All right, Metro design style principles. Microsoft design style. So I said Metro. Someone will have to hold me to that. There are 5 of these guys. Pride and craftsmanship, be fast and fluid, authentically digital, do more with less, and win as one. Is everybody feeling pumped up by this glorious display of marketing psychobabble? Yes. I have a feeling that these names were created by a marketing team sitting in a room. What can we, marketing guys sitting with the design guys, we need good names for this stuff. Okay, that's fine. There's a point to that. You're supposed to remember them, right? They're guiding principles behind the entire design style. So you're supposed to remember them, but you need to have things to associate with them. So let me provide that, and hopefully we won't just remember them for being bad names. Pride and craftsmanship. I think we all know what taking pride in something is, right? But does anybody know what craftsmanship is? Craftsmanship itself, or examples of crafts, I will take either. And no, we don't move on until someone starts the process.
Bricklayer?
Is that?
Like a bricklayer?
Bricklayer, perhaps, yeah, carpenter, tool crafting, blacksmithing. All right, so I gave you all the really good examples of crafts. So now we've got to dig into the forward. Right? Anyone want to take a crack at aspects of craftsmanship? We can slowly build the definition. How you do your work. So process. Okay.
Attention to detail.
Attention to detail. So attention to detail.
Or handmade.
Quality. I heard quality.
Handmade and.
Handmade, let's say care, right? So maybe not always handmade, but we're talking about attention to detail, quality, care,
The
some
methods
sort
of
of
craft,
process.
of making an object.
Yeah, skill. That's awesome. So those are all good components of it. So we'll lace this together now. The way this worked traditionally is you start as an apprentice working under a master. It's lifelong, right? So this is not a job. This is a lifelong career where you're always using the best tools available, paying attention to details, right, to produce high quality output, always learning to become better. So you're gonna go from apprentice to journeyman to master yourself, to have your own apprentice. It's kind of like being a Jedi with much more mundane things, right? We're not wielding lightsabers, we're producing jewels, right, perhaps. That's kind of the approach here, right? So what's really important is that you're always gonna be learning. You're always gonna be trying to become better, right? And you have to, most importantly, sweat the details, all of them. Otherwise you can't produce that high quality output consistently. Now why, oh why, oh why do I have to talk to Arun developers about sweating the details and taking pride and treating software as a craft? How many people have built or worked with this? Something like this. Everybody. Yeah, maybe if not that, maybe this, which is not quite as abusive, but nothing says I've taken a command line user interface and slapped a GUI on it like 27 checkboxes, right? It's a nightmare. It's not to say that these things don't work. They do, hopefully. I mean, if you're gonna do all that, I hope it works. But it's not the best way to design it. And it's certainly not, it's certainly not what a designer would do with these features. It's probably not what a sane developer would do with these things either. Because presumably someone has to work with this, right? But it goes deeper than this. Yes, this is kind of a contrived example, and I'm about to give you another contrived example, but it's much more real world. Please tell me, no one in this room has ever done the following. Working on a new project, working with new set of technology, maybe old technology, and you run into a problem, getting some sort of exception, or you can't figure out how something works. So what do? You open up a web browser. You go to Google, maybe Bing, and you type in the exception, or you type in the problem you're looking for. You look for the first link that says stackoverflow.com with a question that looks like it kind of maps to what you're talking about. And you click on that, and you scan down, you skip the question itself, right? There's a lot of info up there, but who cares about that? You skip down the page to look for the first green check mark, because that's the answer.
The highest number.
Yeah, well, the check mark's the solution, that's the answer, right? And that's got some code that's supposed to work, right? So you copy and paste that right out of Stack Overflow, right into your application. Change some variable names because they don't match your context, and you hit run, and it works. You're like, hallelujah, I never have to touch that again. Yeah. Right, everybody. Okay, this happens so often that I've given this a name. I call it Google Copy Paste, GCP. And I submit to you that if you GCP on a regular basis, that you're not treating software like a craft. And I think we're all guilty of this to a certain extent. Rewind. What would the Craftsman do? Now, I've told you that the Craftsman will use the best tools available. So, the Craftsman does open the web browser, does go to Google or Bing, does type in what they're looking for, does go to Stack Overflow, reads the question though, right? Let me understand if this person has the same problem as me. How many times have you gone somewhere thinking that that first Stack Overflow link was talking about what you were looking for, only to find it really wasn't after you went down and looked at the solution? If you had read the question, you would know right away. So that's the first step. The second step maybe is to go look at the green check mark, and maybe even try the code that's there. It's what happens next. Go back to the Stack Overflow question and look at the stuff below the green check mark. In particular, the ones that have been voted up, right, a lot. Because sometimes there's stuff with higher numbers than the one that has the green check mark. The things that you want to look for, especially if it's your Stack Overflow question, are comments like, have you tried thinking about the problem like this? Which is an indication that either you or the original questioner is not thinking about the problem correctly. That's a subtle hint to kind of go back and think about it for a second before someone gives you an answer. Maybe you can solve it yourself. But the most important one is, have you read this section of this documentation? A lot of times I know what document has my answer in it, but there may be like 100 pages. And having someone shortcut you right to the part that you should read is very powerful. So check that first. Or at least check that after you've gotten the thing working. Take 5 minutes, try to learn something from this problem that you just had so that you don't face it again in the future. You'll know how to do that thing. Off the soapbox. Make it safe and reliable. This is a big goal of Windows 8. So making things consistent, having one consistent place to put certain things that we've found numerous ways to do. One of them in particular, settings. Does that go into tools, options, edit preferences, edit settings? Like we've come up with maybe 10 to 12 different places within the menu to put settings related things. And then since no one's ever going to find that consistently, we've also come up with settings buttons that we'll slap on the GUI, and like hopefully someone will click that instead. But it gets worse. What happens when we click on it? Modal dialog, non-modal dialog, tabbed, wizard, what's the approach? It's not consistent. Do they save automatically, or do I have to click a save button? Like, it's not consistent. It's a nightmare. So Windows 8, with a very strong UI model, has things like the charms bar and the apps bar. One of them is the settings charm, right? You tap it, you get high-level overview, top-level categories. Click category, you get the settings for that category. That's how every app does settings. The user will learn that once, and it applies to every app, right? That's what we're talking about here with safe and reliable. When the user goes to take a step within the application, they should feel confident that they're about to do the right thing and not have to guess. Balance, symmetry, hierarchy, aligning to the grid, that all comes back to the international typographic style that we talked about earlier, just following the grid. So that should be fairly straightforward. This is a New York Times from 1910s, around that time period. Even if I could zoom in on this, right? Zoom and enhance, zoom and enhance. Even if I could do that, you'd have a hard time reading this. Why? Well, we have inconsistent usage of fonts. In fact, about 20 different fonts used inconsistently. There's a couple, I've seen the full resolution of this, there's a couple bylines in here that are completely different. One's italicized and one's not. Right? These are things that wouldn't happen in a paper today. Why did it happen here? And why is that third column tilted about 18 degrees? And why are the paragraphs on the leftmost column bunched up together, and the ones in the fourth and fifth and sixth columns spread out? That's not intentional, by the way. This is a hand-set newspaper.
Like 4 or 5 different guys did this page.
Exactly, right? And it might be a different 4 or 5 guys today than it is tomorrow because someone's out sick. You don't have a computer doing this, right? And what's worse is you don't get the nice user features like this article is continued on page A8. Imagine trying to keep that in your head when the 4 or 5 guys that are working on this are trying to lay it out. Hey, no, that goes on page 8. No, that ain't happening. But that's not to say that this is bad. This is to say that from a craftsman's perspective, this is the best they could do. They are using the best tools that they had available. What I am saying is you don't get here if you don't evolve as things come out. Right? This is done with the computer. We do get page A8. We do get consistent bylines. We do get consistent line spacing. And where it's not the same line spacing, it's intentional. Right? We know that this is being laid out using the best tools, state of the art. How does that apply to software? We get new tools all the time. So we get new versions of Visual Studio. We get new versions of our favorite text editors. We get new snippets, new libraries. In fact, libraries. If you want to stay up to date, go check out one of the 6 JavaScript libraries that have been developed since this talk started. Go check one out. You'll learn something. The point is, just move with the times. And coming back around to the craftsmanship angle, pay attention to things like this typographic grid. It's very important. Makes your app fit in with the rest of the Windows 8 apps that are out there. So that's pride and craftsmanship. Be fast and fluid. This is the most overused of the 5. If you go back to 2011's Build conference and do a tally on the number of times this is said across all of the sessions, you'll find it's a lot. In fact, there was a drinking game for this term. Please don't go back and watch those videos and play that game. It's dangerous. I value your liver as much as mine. But it's important. Life is mobile. So users spend nearly 1 hour on their devices, but the average application session, which is opening an app to closing it, lasts a little more than a minute. We're talking about 71.56 seconds on average. Now that's on a phone, but this equally applies to smaller tablets and even full-size tablets where the apps are consumer-oriented, right? We're not in these things very long. We're consuming a little bit of data, maybe typing up a Facebook status, and we're out of there. So if the app's not good, right, because people are on the go, if the app's not good, you get that 1 minute that first time to make a good first impression. And you get 1 minute every time after that to reinforce that it was a good decision to get it in the first place. So keep that in mind. But more importantly, delight with motion, intuitive interaction, be responsive and ready. These are all talking about designing for right, we need more volume and maybe some visual reinforcement. Touch, 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 and more touch. Why is Ballmer once again repeating words at us? Right? Developers, 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 touch, touch, touch. Yeah, this guy is like the master of repeating words. Thankfully, we won't have to endure that much longer. But why is he harping about touch? Well, touch is here. Whether you've acknowledged it or not, touch screens are everywhere. If you don't believe me, go to Best Buy with a sheet of paper with a line down the middle, and on the left put touch, and on the right put non-touch, and perform the following test. Walk up to every screen that you see and go like this. If the screen moves with your finger, it's touch, and if it doesn't, it's not touch. And if you don't believe that, look at the card. In fact, where it used to say this is a touch screen, it now says non-touch. That's how many of these that are there. I did this a couple weeks ago, 18 touch screens to 8 non-touch screens. Right? Most of the consumer available machines right now are touch screens. So we need to talk about touch and how perhaps it's a little bit different than mouse and keyboard. So first, mouse and keyboard, right? I'm moving some oblong object over here that's either connected by a wire or wireless. And when I do that, some pointer moves over here. And I click a button here, and it clicks a button here. Or I click and hold a button here, and I can move things over there, right? There's a lot of indirection, a little bit of abstraction, and it's completely not intuitive the first time you ever used it. Don't believe me?
That was close. I mean, can you imagine if we lost this kill code? Uh-oh!
Tackle shop.
Dad, you're okay. Great. I need a favor. The fate of the world depends on it.
Okay then, Skip. What do you need?
I just need you to go into my lab, get on my computer, and email a file to my cell phone.
That's your user right there. Gets worse.
Have a call, but you have
Depends
back.
on
Yeah.
you, man.
Oh, okay, great. On the screen, there's a file marked kill code. Move that into my email window. Ha! Type in my name and press send.
Window.
Hey, Dad, you see the thing that looks like a little piece of paper? Use the mouse to drag it.
Drag it.
Drag it.
Drag it.
Drag it. It's not drag. Drag it across the desktop.
That didn't do anything.
Of course it didn't. You know what? Ah!
Anybody know that guy? I know a couple of those guys. Perhaps a little exaggerated, but not too far from the point. Right? It's not the most straightforward of things, and not everybody gets it the first time or the second time they see it. Touch is a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a second, but let's look at a scenario that kind of illustrates some other subtle different points about this. Let's assume the person knows how to use a mouse. They're using an application that has a button that when they click it, there's going to be no visual indication that anything happened because the developer is going to make a 2-minute long synchronous database call. Why? Who knows? It's a contrived example. But when the person clicks it, the application's just going to hang. The first thing that the user is likely to think is, what is wrong with this application? Why is it not doing anything? Right? If they're savvy enough to know that there's a wizard behind the machine known as a developer, they'll think, what is wrong with the guy that wrote this program? And eventually they're going to close the application. But that initial thought is, what is wrong with this application? Why is it not doing anything? We move to touch. Now, I've got a direct interaction with that button. Same application, I'm going to tap it, and no feedback, nothing, no progress bars, no visual highlight that I tapped it. And I tap the button, and that happens, nothing happens, right? What is the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th thing that's probably likely to happen? Yeah, jamming the button. Why? Well, the first thought is, did I miss? Did I not press it hard enough? Do I need to tap it again? Nothing there is about the application. Everything's about the user. What mistake did the user make? Why does the user now feel bad about themselves? Well, it's a cognitive switch. I've now got this physical interaction with the application. And without the proper cues, right, without the proper design for touch, a properly sized hit area for the button, good touch feedback that something has happened, when nothing happens, the user is always going to think that was their fault because they're actually in control of something. It's not a mouse, you know. Everyone thinks, okay, the pointer was over it and I clicked a button. Unless the mouse is broken, which is easily testable by clicking on something else, it's not the user's fault. Something wrong in the application. But in touch, there's all kinds of places that things can go wrong if we don't design for touch. And you don't ever want to make your user feel like they've made a mistake. It's not their fault. So designing for touch, because of these different nuances from a cognitive perspective, is important. This is not a Rorschach. I'm not going to ask you what this, obviously they're not black. I need to update that so at least one of them's black. But it's not an ink blot. I'm not going to ask you what it looks like. So it's not a butterfly. It's not an alien. In fact, it's a finger painting exercise. Even better. Landscape tablet-shaped pieces of paper that were given to usability test subjects at Microsoft. Paint in purple, what's easy for your thumb to reach. Paint in pink, what's a little bit harder to reach. And the circles represent resting spots for the hand. Another test subject using green and pink, same circles, obviously a different hand size. So they did a lot of this. And if you do a lot of this, and perhaps even buy a military database of hand sizes, you can do something cool like this, which is to overlay sort of a heat map over top of the UI that you're proposing, and kind of see if that's going to work, right? Everything within the content regions is reachable with the thumb for the most part. Interesting things crop up, like on the right-hand side in that green area, that's where the charms showed up. Down in the lower corners, in that yellow area, that's the extent of the recommended number of commands within the app bar, 3. Possibly 4, but that's only for things that are transient, that appear temporarily. The back button up in the top, right, reachable by that left thumb. So this whole interface has been designed around this type of study, right? None of it's arbitrary. Keep that in mind when you're thinking about whether you want to break things like the content region or that left margin that I talked about earlier, right? You may be doing a disservice not only to your users but to other users when they use other applications, because yours is going to stick out like a sore thumb, right? It's kind of these guidelines are based on lots and lots and lots of study. One last component of this, immersive and compelling, brief story time. I have a friend who the iPad was the first computer. His grandma, the iPad was the first computer she ever used, despite the fact that computers have been around for a long portion of her life. This is the first one that was approachable enough to kind of capture her. Why? He loaded up books and movies and songs, a couple games, tons of pictures of the grandkids, home movies, and with light guidance, got her to use the thing. And she was drawn into it because the experience is there. I'm not necessarily sure that we're there yet with the Windows Store, but hopefully at some point I can replace this story with someone using a Surface 2 for the first time. Instead of an iPad, because I know the Microsoft guys get all, it's an iPad, touchy-feely. But the point is, like, this is an immersive and compelling experience, and it did capture this subset of users. Now, this is not the only class of users coming at these digital devices for the first time. In fact, just give a kid an iPad. Immersive and compelling, but not really what I'm looking for. Give a kid an iPad, and watch how fast they learn these things. Phones, iPads, anything. If you got a kid in the household, try this out. If not, borrow a 3-year-old, hand them your phone. Watch out for that though. But watch how fast they learn these things. They'll figure out what the icons do on the home screen. They'll figure out back buttons. They'll figure out how applications work. They'll learn how to play Angry Birds better than their parents within 24 hours. I've got a friend who's got a kid who can find Netflix buried in the folder on the iPad on the second screen, launch it, and find the exact episode that she's looking for. That's nuts, but it's true. Why? different mode of thinking, different mode of learning. They are learning by doing because it's all they have. They touch things that are dangerous to see if they're dangerous. They put things in their mouth to see if they're food, right? They play with this device with a clean slate mindset and figure out how it works. We don't do that. Why? Because we carry a lot of baggage from past experiences. Mouse, keyboard, maybe all the way back to punch cards. We come from an analog world, mixed, maybe some of us are closer to the digital age, but we do have some analog baggage that we've dragged along. Leads me to talk briefly about authentically digital. I say briefly because it's not super important anymore. It's not as important as it was when I first started giving this talk. Because what we're ultimately talking about here is what is not authentically digital. What is not authentically digital is this. Right? Seen this before? iBooks, iPad. Why is this not authentically digital? Well, it's a bookshelf, right? That's a bookshelf. No, it's not a bookshelf. It's an application screen that's been made to look like a bookshelf. And the books, when you tap them, fan out and open up like a book opening. It's glorious, right? And then the page turns, right? You got this nice page curl animation where the page sticks to your finger and you can kind of look through the page and the text is reflected as if you were looking through the page. That's cool. But it's certainly not authentically digital. That is a analog world replica. We've got a term for this. It's called skeuomorphism. S-K-E-U-O, morphism. And what that means is taking a design element out of a context where it's required, introducing it into a context where it's not required, solely for the purpose of familiarity. Right? That context has been lifted from here and introduced here, just because it will be familiar for someone looking at it or using it. In this case, it's the bookshelf and the books. On jeans, it's rivets. Guaranteed, rivets at the seam points. Right? They're not rivets anymore, they're little metal discs that have been tacked onto the jeans. At some point, someone decided that they wouldn't look right without those, even though they weren't required anymore. Why, though, do we do this, and why can we move away from it now? Why is Apple moving to a flat design? Why do they feel comfortable with that? No, it's not because Forstall's gone. It's because we don't need the crutch. To understand why we needed the crutch in the first place, we have to go back to 2007. It's a phone, it's an internet communication device, it's an iPod. It's a phone, it's an internet communication device, it's an iPod. These are not three devices, they're one, and we call it the iPhone. Steve Jobs on stage, changing the digital landscape. Why? Because no one was using full screen multi-touch devices as their primary device, phone, before that device was introduced. Now, pretty much everybody has them. You've all seen the things where phones before the iPhone, phones after the iPhone. The ones after look much more like the iPhone than the ones we had before. Now, Steve was always a little bit worried about people not completely grasping technology, certain subsets of his users. And without buttons on the device, he was worried that they wouldn't be able to figure it out. So things that had real-world counterparts, like calculators and calendars and these sorts of things, were made to look like their real-world equivalents, hoping that that would bring those people into the fold. I'd submit it works. There's a lot of people that I know that find this helpful, that might not have completely grasped it if it was more like the Windows 8 approach back when it first came out, right, where we've just got the book covers. I think it's fairly straightforward to all of us now, but I'm not sure that it was in 2010 when not everyone was using consumer tablets. This is, again, more the flat page turn approach. This calendar, in particular, I don't know that necessarily that younger crowd that's coming to these devices will ever really deal with a paper, tear the sheet off kind of calendar. Why? They've got a device that's got the time and date and their schedule on it. Why do you need this thing, right? So these torn bits of paper edges like going across the top of this calendar that if you've never seen before, you'll never unsee again. It's not important anymore because no one's ever going to rip that sheet off again. Right? Maybe we will because maybe we're used to doing this, but they're not. They're going to be much more likely to be interacting with a calendar that looks like this. Or, since this comes from the analog world too, maybe another way of looking at time and date altogether. Not a page at a time, but maybe a more continuous approach. Because this whole analog versus digital stuff goes much deeper. We've got still floppy disks representing save. We're using terms like logging in and logging out, which is signing in and signing out when you came into the building down there. That's a logbook, right? Posting to blogs as if it were a bulletin board with a thumbtack, right? We've still got a lot of concepts. The whole premise of a desktop, right? The guy did literally swipe the mouse across the desktop because that's where his state of mind is. Desktop, files and folders, right? So putting the file in the folder and putting it on the desktop, right? That's an analog metaphor. We need to lose some of those over time to sort of explore where we can go down the road. I don't have answers for that, but it's a good thing to think about. Do more with less. Be great at something is the only thing other than content before creme that I'm going to hit on here. Be great at something, don't be good at something, don't be mediocre at something, be great at something. Start with a best at statement when you start with your Windows 8 application. My application, insert application name here, is best in, insert category name here, at. What does it do? 10, maybe 15 words. Keep it concise. Keep it focused and direct, like the second bullet point says. Why? Because it's going to make your app actually the best in its category at doing that. Because when you go to brainstorm the features that you're going to put in the application, make a big list. Write them all out. But cross off all the ones that don't conform to the best at statement. You'll be left with maybe 3 to 6, maybe 7, to actually implement in the application versus the 30 that you might write down. And you're left with a better application for it. Content before Chrome, this is pushing things like menus and toolbars and action buttons and settings menus and these sorts of things, hierarchical trees, pushing them out of the user interface to focus on the content of the application, not the surrounding infrastructure. Still have these things in the application, but they're going to be off the screen edges. We'll talk about where those go when we get to the example. Windows 1, Windows 8's got a strong UI model fit into it. So we've got contracts, we've got an app bar, we've got charms, we've got an nav bar, and we've got tons of guidelines around how these things should work. Follow them. Learn about them and follow them. Reducing redundancy, this thankfully comes out of fitting into the UI model. Working together to complete scenarios, the best example of this is the share contract. So say I implement a finger painting application. Someone creates a masterpiece, and a little kid creates a masterpiece, wants to share it with the rest of the family. Best avenue for that, they're all on Facebook. So classically, I would have to bring the Facebook SDK into my application. And now if Facebook changes their API, I break. And I've got to fix that, resubmit to the Windows Store, which takes me through another review process, and for a certain period of time, that's not going to work. And the problem with that, right, is that wasn't probably part of your best at statement. Sharing with grandma was probably not part of the best at statement, so it's not a primary feature. Wouldn't it be much better if I could just simply say, my application at some point is going to have a picture to share, and I want to be able to share it. Register that with the system. That's how the share source contract works. Windows 8, when that's requested through the share charm, Windows 8 will say, okay, this application over here is looking to share a picture. Is there any application on the system that knows how to do that? And it's going to provide a list to the user. And they'll pick the one that they want to use, and maybe input some text for the status to go with the photo or caption to go with the photo, and hit share. That gets passed off to the other application. They're a shared target. So Windows 8 acts as a broker and negotiates the two sides of the contract. You don't have to write any code to know anything about how Facebook works, or how Twitter works, or how any other application on the system works, but you gain access to all of them just by taking part in the share source side. So if you have stuff in your application that can be shared, share it. It's practically free. Tools and templates, design and scale, again, use Visual Studio and Blend, use the templates that are in them. They provide a lot of infrastructure that helps with scaling from 8-inch tablets all the way up to 100+ inch touchscreen TVs someday. So those are the principles. Can we apply them to a desktop application and take it to Windows 8? Yes, we can. Don't do this, but Microsoft did this. This was an exercise that Microsoft did. They sat people down in front of Windows 7, had them use an application for a little bit, and then asked them to draw it. An alarming number of times, they got this. What does this application do? Who knows? because the only thing that's been drawn here is the Chrome, the window Chrome.
Scrolls.
No, it doesn't, there's no content. So, yeah, scroll bars are super helpful when there's no content. Yeah, it could scroll. It minimizes, it maximizes, and it closes, and the menu probably, presumably, does something. But we've lost the content of the application in the process of thinking about the OS itself, which is what people kind of get locked into. They did the same exercise with Windows 8 with an application, and the most common thing was to draw the tiles and the title, which is all content after we deal with how to approach it. Jensen Harris in the original build conference used this example. I thought it was a fairly good example, but I don't think it was presented perhaps the best way that it could be. He had a lot to talk about, so we'll give him some slack. But the first thing that we want to do when we kind of think about this is, what is that best at statement, right? I'm assuming that it's the RSS reader is the best in the news category at helping people keep up to date with the things that they care about, or something direct like that. I'd say that this doesn't really do a good job of that, because only 30% roughly of the screen is devoted to the actual article itself. And that's what we're going to try to tackle here, so that we can move some of the focus more onto the articles themselves. First thing we need to do is kind of clean this up, right? So we're looking for that clean, modern-looking, flat style, so we get rid of gradients and hard lines. It gets us part of the way there, but we still got a lot to work with. We've got a lot of pieces and parts in here that belong somewhere else in Windows 8. So let's look at these as pieces and parts individually. So we've got branding, app name, some sort of logo, reinforce this throughout the app, right? Sort of looks like that. This guy here, I'm gonna lie to you for a second and say that this is all gonna go off screen, but that was true in Windows 8, it's not true in Windows 8.1. So in Windows 8.1, if you take a look at it, take a look at the Windows Store application, the news application, the sports application, anything that has strong search, there's a persistent search box that'll be in the upper right corner. This is Microsoft admitting that A, their implementation of the search charm was pretty hard to figure out for most people, and B, they weren't finding the search charm to begin with. So if search, so they're acknowledging search is important, so let's bring a search box back into the app. You're still going to use the search contract, but that whole search charm, searching every application, that's all gone in Windows 8.1. So if you want search, put a search box in your app. The principles that we're looking at here, do more with less, and Windows 1, to do more with less, we lose because we're actually bringing the search box back. But Windows 1 is fitting into the UI model and using the search contract. Settings, we talked about settings and the bajillion places we could put it, and we also talked about how there's one, wow, my charms bar is over there somewhere. There's a settings charm at the bottom of the charms bar, which is where that goes. You can see it on the screen. Right, so all settings is going to go under that charm. Again, do more with less. We're pushing the settings menu and the settings buttons off screen until they're needed. And Windows 1 fitting into the UI model. App commands is going the app bar at the bottom, right? No more than 3 or 4 on either side. The same two principles we've been talking about apply here. Do more with less, pushing stuff off screen until they're needed. Windows 1 fitting into the UI model, but we're also introducing Be Fast and Fluid. Why? Designed for touch, right? So this is all implemented around designing for touch. Here we've got organization, grouping, hierarchy, these sorts of concepts. Windows 8.1 actually has a fairly consistent place to put this. It's an app bar at the top. If you've been using Windows 8 for a while, if you look in the news application or the sports application, they've been using this the way they're proposing to use it in Windows 8.1 for a while. So you've got a lot of sort of deep linking. You can kind of drill in on the sports application. You can drop down an individual sport and go jump directly to standings for that sport. That's a way to kind of get this sort of grouping and hierarchy into your application, just not in this tree form on screen. These last two boxes represent the content in the application. The first one is the content overview. In its list form, as we see it here, it's not always super useful. I can think of one case where it is, email. Most of the time that I go into my email application, I don't read a single email. I just scan that list for what I haven't read, what's important, perhaps has a flag that indicates high priority, or did it come from my boss, whatever. Any of those I might read. Anything else I probably won't read till later because I'm trying to get something done. So that list is very helpful in that case. In this RSS reader case, not so much. Other ways to represent it, so we're going to push it off screen and focus solely on the content details themselves. The heart of the application, the whole point of the application, we're going to devote the whole screen to it. Now Jensen said we would do it like this. And we'd have an article view where we could actually read the article. And it's fine. It fits in on Windows 8. But it's got that kind of canonical Windows 8 is a bunch of boxes kind of look to it, right? And it's also missing some key elements. This was done with the first developer preview. Anyone that used that knows that these grid groupings looked just like titles, so is it interactive or not? Who knows? They added a chevron later to indicate that that was tappable. What's also missing there, though, is some context that we can pull back out of the overview. How many unread articles in that feed are there? Right, we could show that there. And speaking of the individual articles themselves, have I read that one or not? That's another thing that we lost from the list. So perhaps we could badge them or color them differently if they haven't been read yet. So we can pull those concepts back in. You need to think about your individual application scenario. What are you losing as you're pushing stuff off screen? And find ways for things that are important to bring them back in on screen. It's nice that we've elevated the photography aspect out of the article so that we can kind of get a nice look at what we're about to read and kind of entice the person to actually read the thing, but we've lost some context along the way. Thankfully, there's an RSS reader that's in Windows 8 that ships with it. It's that news application that we've talked about a couple times already. Now, when I first started doing this talk, when I first started writing the book, this was nothing but a glorified RSS reader, where essentially it was just premium sources. You have New York Times, Reuters, etc. Now, you're able to put in your own RSS feeds into this. So it really is an RSS reader. But it's got different ways of showing stories to kind of draw you into them. And it's got the navbar implemented for you, so you can check out how that would work. But we got this nice big hero section for the top headline. And as we move through the app, we reinforce this using photography, using sort of almost like a newspaper layout for this news. It's kind of cool. But this application layout, this hero section, and then these sections of arbitrary layout, it's a very common way of implementing Windows 8 applications, but it's very difficult to pull off with the templates that come out of the box. The closest thing to it is the grid application template, which is what that previous example was. But hacking in the hero section and kind of getting arbitrary layout within the grid sections is very difficult. Thankfully, Windows 8.1 throws us a bone, a new template called the Hub application template. If you are starting a new Windows 8 application in 8.1, start it with this template. You can thank me later. But if you don't need this big hero section up front, delete it. It's not essential. But those sections are where you're going to gain the most bang for your buck out of using this template. They support arbitrary layout, which means section 1 and section 2 can be laid out completely differently. They can have independent data sets and can sort of, I can show in one section content with bigger boxes, and maybe on the next section it's a list view. It's the same type of content, but the sections are laid out completely differently. In 8.1, the best application to look at to see how this works is the Windows Store, which has been completely redesigned to use this template, and it does a very good job of it. One last thing before I wrap it up, lots of commands. I get this a lot. Well, you just told me that I can only have 3 app bar buttons per side. That seems completely limiting. It is very limiting. You can do things like pop-up menus off those buttons if that helps, but it's not going to get you something like OneNote, where we've got a ribbon and probably up to 100 commands to support. Contextual commands based on whether we've got an image selected or a table selected or text selected. There is an application on the Windows Store called OneNote MX. It's from this team. And they approach this problem this way. This control is called a radial menu. It starts off collapsed down to the size of an app bar button, and it follows your cursor around the page. You can move it somewhere else if you want to, and it'll stay there. But when you tap on it, it fans out into this menu. the way this works is the buttons on the inside, these are commands that'll directly interact with things, and then the little purple guys down below drill in farther into a menu along a certain axis. So depending on what the command is, the next level down, it'll be things related to that. So like if it was paste, paste at the top level, if I hit the arrow where paste was, it might be paste original, paste and match style, you know, whatever the different paste options are. It's very powerful and you can roll up a ton of commands into this thing, and they're contextual, so if you've got an image selected, the first things you'll see are image commands. If you've got nothing selected, it'll be a top level kind of deal. Microsoft doesn't provide this. Okay? They don't provide this at all in the tool chain. They haven't provided it in any extra library that's coming afterwards. And I leave this in here to point out that sometimes that happens on platforms. The platform vendor themselves are not going to give you all the tools that you need. You either need to create them yourself or buy them from companies like mine. We're making one of these, our competitors are making one of these, go for it. That's not my point. My point is more for you guys to build the stuff that you need when you realize that you need it. Something like pull to refresh that we have on most phones now, right? That didn't come from Apple originally, that came from Lauren Richter implementing a feature in a Twitter client. And then everybody kind of looked at it and said, hey, that's cool. Now it's everywhere. A couple of applications on iOS had this little slide in from the left menu, right? The little hamburger button, you know, stack 3 lines, right? Now that's baked into Android. Right? Those things don't come necessarily from the platform vendor. They come from developers like the people in this room. If you need something, build it. And maybe you'll get rolled into an SDK at some point as well. Article I wrote for a magazine called .NET. It's not capital .NET, so it's not our .NET. It's like internet.net. These are web designers. Mac using, iPhone using, iPad toting web designers. Why did they want an article on Windows 8 design? Well, there's a lot of designers out there that wouldn't mind working within the context of Windows Phone or Windows 8. It has a strong design language. It's something fun for them to tackle, and it hits on some key areas of design history that tickles a lot of their fancy. Why mention it here? Well, if you sat through this and find that Windows 8 has strong design concepts and you recognize that you'll need to follow those when you build your application, but you either think you can't or don't want to do it yourself, you're going to need a designer. They work from anywhere from free up to super expensive, but there's also the revenue share model. Maybe they take a 20% cut of proceeds or something like that if you want to go low risk. Point is, if you need a designer, find one. You'll find one for your budget. If you can't find one, come find me. I gave you a couple ways to contact me. I can put you in touch with guys that I know that can work within your range. I know a lot of guys that do this. One more time, if you found this interesting at all, bit.ly design Win8 will take you to the book. There's 3 chapters that cover things that were not covered here, and the chapters that do cover stuff that we covered here go into more depth in certain areas because I skipped through some stuff. Check that out. Any questions? The obligatory Q&A slide. Yep. Yes.
So this one looks okay for an end user, a consumer perspective, but
Yeah.
for business applications, how do we implement it?
So out on design.windows.com, there is a white paper for line of business applications that goes into a lot of details on sort of the basic thought process behind putting together an LOB app. But more importantly, if you go to Channel 9, go to the build videos for 2013, what you're looking for is a video that was produced by the Dynamics CRM team talking about how they moved their applications to Windows 8. I think you'll find a lot in there. There's a lot of details around form building and sort of workflows that we just don't have time to go into here. But yeah, there's some info out there now. I don't think there's enough guidance still on that, but it sure would help to see like how they're implementing Office, for instance. I think that would provide some key detail. But kind of at the point where you can look at what's there and kind of decide what works best for your particular application. Yes.
Was all this information in the invitation?
I didn't see the invitation. If not, I can provide them with, what are you looking for? The contact info?
Right.
Yeah? Okay, yeah, I can get that.
Yeah.
Please.
Or was it on your business card?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you can send that.
I can send it, we can send it out. Anything else? No? Alright, that's all I got.